Building Indigenous-Black solidarity is essential for confronting the interconnected systems of colonialism, slavery, and racial capitalism that have historically oppressed both communities. By recognizing shared struggles while honoring distinct identities, organizational leaders can foster deeper trust, accountability, and transformative change. This solidarity creates space for collective healing and liberation, rooted in mutual respect and justice. Join us for an in-depth conversation with Elissa Sloan and Couchois Duncan of Change Elemental, along with Ámate Perez of Latinx Racial Equity Project, who will all share valuable insights and experiences from working to build solidarity between Indigenous and Black communities. Welcome, friends, Elissa, Ámate, and Aja. Thank you so much. Deep gratitude for joining us for the podcast. I know each of you is super busy doing all the important work of solidarity and liberation in the world. So I appreciate your pausing to have this conversation. I've been so excited to have it. I know it's taken us about 6 months to schedule this date. So again, thank you for your grace and your generosity and coming to share about some of the Indigenous and Black solidarity work you all have been doing together for some time. As part of Equity in the Center's commitment, our first value in our set of values is being pro-Indigenous and pro-Black. And as a Black person, I am around pro-indigeneity or pro-Indigenousness. That's my learning edge. So I see this conversation as a way for me to learn, as a way for Equity in the Center to learn, and as a way for those who are listening to learn more about being pro-Indigenous. What does it mean to show up in solidarity? And then for some folks, their learning edge is being pro-Black, or both communities are learning edges for them. So I just want to name that I'm coming from a learning position, and that this conversation is part of Equity in the Center's commitment to learning in public, and certainly mine. So please correct me as we go. But I'm here to learn from each of you, and it's been a pleasure to learn from and with each of you over the years. So to start, it would be great if you could introduce yourselves, share a bit about your background and your experience in race equity work. If you want to talk about, in your introduction, how the three of you came together around the particular body of work you've been doing together, feel free. I'm just going to go in the order that I see you on screen. So Elissa, if you'd like to start, and then pass it to Ámate, and then from Ámate to Aja.
Sure. What to say about myself? I'm Elissa, Gabrielle Sloan Perry. I'm pronoun agnostic as long as it's respectful. We're good. I am a director at Change Elemental specifically for the Prefiguring Futures Lab work. I am Black. I am also of Mississippi Choctaw and Cherokee lineages, and queer, and have been in and around this work in different forms for a long time. So that's the short version. I'll just add that I started out as a teacher in a continuation high school, and everything evolved from there. And I will pass it to Ámate. Yeah. After I say thank you for having us and having me. And I'm excited to be here in this conversation with these beautiful people. Okay, on to you, Ámate.
Well, I'm smiling because, three of my favorite people are in this room with me right now. So thank you for having us. And Elissa, Aja, and I have been deep in the journey to explore these questions. And so it's exciting to share it with you. So my name is Ámate Perez. My pronouns are she, we. And I shifted around because I was like, wait, my ancestors are on the wall. I need to have my ancestors with me. And so you'll see on the top, my great-grandmother, Francisca, and Grandpa Samuel Crespin. And below her is my most recent elder ancestor, Cruz Perez Torres, and my grandpa, whose picture's not there. We're very matrilineal. And I'm going to, push my mom to get my grandpa up there. But so I'm from Cuscatlan, which is in Mesoamerica. My people are Nahua and also Chortimaya. And I am the Emergent Strategy Director at Latinx Racial Equity Project. We're a collective of Black and Indigenous Latine people who are decolonizing Latinidad. And I came to this work because a Black elder saved me and really coached me into understanding racism in the U.S. from a Southern Black woman's perspective. That was about 30 years ago, and that was Valerie Batts. And she literally saved my life, because the confronting white supremacy, thinking that I was an exceptional brown person was going to kill me. And so here I am doing this beautiful work with my siblings. Aja, come in.
Yes, it is a pleasure and also strange to be in this configuration of recording with all of you. And, not too long ago, we were together with you too, Kay, in person. My name is Aja Couchois Duncan. I'm mixed race, Anishinaabe, and French and Scottish. And I identify as two-spirit or queer. I use she, her, we pronouns. And I was thinking about this morning and how did I come to this work? And similar to Elissa, through writing and teaching. And all three of us, Ámate, Elissa, and I are active writers. So that's also interesting and something that we share. And working with youth in particular. And then just sort of through the evolution of trying to put together a paycheck, ended up doing what was at the time called diversity trainings, which was basically a storytelling practice where we tried to make ourselves seem acceptable to predominantly white audiences. And, through that ended up somehow in organizational development, leadership development, doing actually racial discrimination investigation. So that was sort of an interesting training ground. And then, we all have been working together in different ways. I'm part of the Change Elemental team with Elissa, and then was part of a project that Ámate co-founded called the Decolonizing Race Project. And we were working, in different identity streams, if you will. So we were working as a Native Circle, and through that got to hold a lot of conversations with people that identified as mixed race Native people. And, having the opportunity to share stories and being able to do the work through storytelling that we do often in consulting and race equity work, which is connecting our individual lived experiences to the systemic, ways in which we're oppressed and that oppression is internalized. So really kind of through a storytelling lens and then somewhat of a legal lens, I think is how I came to this work. And I will turn it back over to you, Kay.
Thanks for sharing. And I'm Kirian Suarez. I always forget to introduce myself. CEO of Equity in the Center. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm joining from Piscataway land. To begin, we wanted to talk a little bit about the shared and distinct historical experiences of oppression and resistance among Indigenous and Black communities, and how I come to this work, how we've approached it in terms of learning within Equity in the Center, is the result of the unique history of Indigenous and African descended people on Turtle Island. So last night I was watching Find Your Roots, and it was this extra special episode where they showed Professor Gates's family history. And this show, when they cover the stories of the descendants of enslaved Africans and or Indigenous folks, it always really drives home for me how we were made on this land. So we're all occupying land on Turtle Island, but really everywhere, of Indigenous folks. And African Americans, as we are called, were made on this land. We're intentionally mixed race. And I see learning about pro-Indigenous, pro-Black solidarity as almost a manifestation of my Americanness. So I just wanted to share that in terms of how I enter the conversation and why I want to learn. Because I think if we're going to be free, get free on this land, it's together. So I invite any of you who might like to start. How do your own identities and positionalities influence how we engage in solidarity work, specifically with regard to Indigenous and Black folks on Turtle Island? I can pick Elissa. I see your square lit up. Go for it.
It did. Wow. Okay. I have so many thoughts. I'm not sure which direction to begin in. Um, will you just repeat the question one more time?
Oh,
And then
sure.
I'll
Okay.
pick a
Can you
direction.
talk a little bit about the shared and distinct historical experiences of oppression and resistance among
Mm,
Indigenous and Black communities?
mhm.
You can start there if you like.
Yeah. Well, I'll talk about my way in. Um, and it's twofold. One, I feel like I know actually, I came here knowing some things, and with some questions. I didn't know what those things were or where they came from, but, had recurring dreams as a child, that were very much related to both struggles and the intertwined nature of these struggles. So was carrying that and asking questions and behaving in ways that were living out that wisdom I was born with. Then I also had lots of questions. I knew that my maternal grandmother looked different than the rest of the family. And before I was old enough to know better, or got the side eye enough times, I would also always ask my grandmother, "What are you?" And her answer was always either colored or Black. And it wasn't until I was in my 20s that she told me she was Choctaw. And I asked her why. Um, she always said she was Black. And she said, because where I was in rural Mississippi when I was coming up, it was safer to be Black, because there was a community, and when her own mother passed, it was her Black neighbors that took her in when she was 13. So I mean, having visited Mississippi growing up, I grew up in St. Louis and Osage lands. I understood something about the experience of racism and anti-Blackness that actually kind of felt. I mean, it's what I imagine it is to feel like being persecuted, right? And the idea that it was safer to be Black was her experience just gutted me. Um, and that's having a cousin who had been dragged to death a Black cousin who had been dragged to death behind a pickup truck, right? Like knowing that still. So that kind of sent me on my own investigation and starting to learn many of the stories that had been disappeared and distorted, wanting to learn more about my own lineages, and also understanding the intentional separation of Black folks who were actually indigenous Africans who were stolen. Right. So the disappearance of Black folks' indigeneity and the disappearance of indigeneity on Turtle Island. Yeah, that's what sent me originally down this path. Those twin things, what I came here with and what I was experiencing in my own family and the history I knew of my own family.
Yeah. Thanks for
Mm-hmm.
sharing that.
Mm-hmm.
I can resonate with having difficulty understanding the choice to be Black in the South, because I heard a similar story from my aunt when I was about 8 or 9. And it kind of stuck with me because I was like, how could it be worse than being Black, when the context is being lynched? And she was like, but there was lower than that. And I do think I've continued, not investigations, but like trying to understand that, like why that choice would be made. And then realizing that within the broader structural oppression in which Indigenous people have been invisibilized, there is a thread where they were disappeared into Blackness by choice because it was safe. Again, hard to wrap your head around.
Yeah.
and then devastating when you get it. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Ámate or Aja, invite you all in.
Aja, you go. I went second last, so you go. Okay. I'll go after you.
I'll follow the thread of exploration starting at family. So part of the lived experience of the systemic erasure is that I'm from a family that has erased its own family through multiple generations of separation and a lack of communication and connection. And so that experience of being Native was very isolated. And what my mother did was spend a lot of time with Black people. And so I grew up, in the late 70s where love and family meant being with Black people. And so I would say that is part of what brought me to the work around centering and presencing Black people and their experience and their material well-being and like all of the things that repair was needed. And what was the longer journey for me was actually like, what does it mean to actually be Native? And what is that repair, healing, and, reparations or rematriation efforts need to be. And, in the continuation of the sort of like, just even like with quantum blood law, like Indians always disappear. Like there's no narrative in which the Indians don't disappear. Like how much that like gets internalized. And so we erase ourselves and our connection. And then it can be really live and fraught among Native peoples because we play that out of like, who's Native and how Native are you? Like I get like on almost a daily basis, people asking me what percentage I am. And I'm like, is there any other context where you ask people like what percentage of brown units that you are? Or how Black are you really? Like you may think it, but you aren't going to say that out loud. So, I would say like, I think what's interesting about interesting being a euphemism for deeply fucked up, about the difference is the way, it's like the one drop rule for like Black identity, right? Like you can never not be Black. Or, maybe if you pass the paper bag test, like maybe, and there are stories of people who have disappeared into whiteness, but it's more of a fixed category in terms of like you're there and you stay there. And so like that different path has created all kinds of complications for our people solidarity, including Black and Native people, right, who are disappeared in Native communities. And it also makes it really potent for us to be doing this work together because there's so much healing needed.
I have to name it, right? Like racialized capitalism. It was safer for Native people to be in Black community because Black people were property and Native people were a threat to property because they were a threat. We are a threat to land and, entitlement to lands, stolen lands. And so, just when we see it through an economic system, not just a racialized system of ideology to create hierarchy, but that underneath that is the accumulation of wealth and the othering of land and other beings and the destroying of a whole cosmovision that has to do with understanding how the universe works. And so, for me, I started to see Black people as Indigenous, when I got close to my mentor, Valerie Batts, because literally she would tell everything in stories, like just about how she grew up as a little girl in the South and what her father did and what her mother did and what her grandmother did. And they were just all these very rich narratives that I was like, oh, there's something really familiar. She's been talking for 20 minutes and I'm fucking loving it, And so there was a way that her way of describing things, the cadence of her voice, the tone, like there was something so familiar that I started to really think about, why is it that they work so hard to separate us? And the reason why is because within us, there's all this grounded sense of knowing, and some things have not been broken. Like the
it's
way
actually
that
true wealth, right?
Right. It's
Yeah.
true wealth.
Yeah.
And the ways that like Black people relate to each other, like, when you're in a room full of Black folk, someone walks in and there's so much joy and there's like this abundance of welcoming. And there's a way that we have continued, Black folk and Turtle Island, Black Indigenous people and Turtle Island Indigenous people have continued to practice our indigeneity. And so I love that you have a decolonizer shirt, because it starts with decolonizing ourselves, right? To say, what if the way I live my life is actually walking in Indigenous African paths, that I hadn't labeled that and thought of that in that way? And why haven't I thought of it in that way? And I think that as Black folk start to decolonize themselves and recover and rewalk the path of indigeneity, we're going to find so much more synergy. So instead of like competitiveness, we can build on each other's indigeneity. And so the work that the three of us are doing is about that. It's about saying, like, in what ways can we, instead of indigeneity being reductive, how can it be expansive? So that, because when indigeneity is expansive, Mother Earth resources won't be resources. They will be other beings that we coexist with. Like, how do we bring more matriarchal values into the way that we manage how we live our lives and how much we exploit and use? What if we shifted from using and exploiting to being in co-relationship? I mean, it could just really transform the world. And I think that's why they fear us. And that's why we've been pushed so far apart. From my own, as a Latina person who grew up thinking I was an ignorant peasant who had no value in this country, to coming to the US and then being told that I was brown and then that I was, Latina. And then, it took me a long time to actually claim who I am and to start to see, oh, wait, I grew up in this traditional home that I felt so embarrassed by, right? And yet, there's a way that I learned so much about how to be in relationship to others in that humble adobe home. And so it's been a beautiful journey. And I love working with my two siblings as we recover our full humanity.
Thank you to each of you for sharing that, or sharing all of what you did. And I got out my decolonizer shirt because I thought it was appropriate for today. And also because I do like to wear it as a reminder for the reasons that you said, Ámate. It's like continuous process of decolonization. I guess going back to the beginning of our relationship with EIC and Native Americans in philanthropy. So the first time I sat in a circle practice that was held by Indigenous folks, because Black folks have circle, and all of us have circle practices that, of course, came from Indigenous practice. But the first time I was in a circle that was held by Indigenous folks and the elders started talking, I was like, so we're going to be here all day. And it was extremely familiar. I was like, I'm just going to settle in. We're going to be here till we're, for as long as it takes. It's going to be a while. But it felt like home in a way. We are similar in our cultural practices, and we were intentionally separated because if we got together, just like we were separated from poor white folks going back, in the history of this country. Because yes, if we all got together, then we could collectively tear the system down. That's been built to preference and privilege and create wealth for just a few of us. Well, not us here on this recording studio, but for white men mostly. I
want to give a shout out to the Haitians, because actually they did, as Indigenous people living on the island of Haiti, they actually did fight for their freedom, and they were severely punished for it. And the legacy of that continues.
Yeah, they're still being punished for it.
They're still being punished. And so some people, they did. And they're such an inspiration.
Yeah. One thing I love about my Haitian brothers and sisters is that when they introduce themselves, they lead with that. And it's such an important lesson, I feel, for me as a Black American, that their sense of identity and place in the world is rooted in that revolution, like successful revolution. And then, of course, the devastating flip side of the coin, which is that they have paid for it and today are still paying for it, which is, a horrible case study of how white supremacy operates and what happens when you resist. And they were intentionally made an example of for doing what they did. Since EIC focuses primarily on supporting organizations in thinking through issues of equity and solidarity, my next question is about organizations and how might organizational structures reinforce anti-Indigenous or anti-Black racism, even unintentionally. And I think a lot of that has come up in the different threads of this conversation. But I'm wondering, where do you think, because we are programmed to be anti-Indigenous and anti-Black, where do tensions and challenges arise as we work to build solidarity? Because often we're our own worst enemy, not just in organizations, but as individuals, because we are working to decolonize ourselves as individuals. So then there's a process for that for organizations and for society. So how do you see that work unfolding, and what recommendations or models might you offer to those listening as they seek to do this work? Aja, do you want to start?
Yeah. I'm like, am I going to say all the things I actually think? I guess the answer is, once you turn 55, yes. You're going to say everything you think. I think one example is the hyper-visibility and untenable expectations placed predominantly on Black women to like fix, repair everything wrong in every organization ever, in the one job that doesn't even include that thing. And it is kind of like a replication of the hypervisibility of like Black identity and like kind of excessive responsibility for like healing racism somehow. And then like land acknowledgement without any sort of relationship or rematriation, so it's like, again, this like erasure, like, I'm sorry, you're all dead. It's a bummer, but we're just going to, keep on keeping on, or you are going to be the magical being that is going to repair everything in your role 40 hours a week, and we ain't going to give you any more money for it. And, it's just like, it's kind of a continual manifestation of the same thing. So, I would say that like equity work that doesn't include rematriation and reparations efforts are not real. It's just about expanding access to goods and services of, racialized capitalism and enslavement and stolen land. And, that feels like a lot at an organizational level, meanwhile, while you're doing other things too. So it's interesting that a lot of us have been sort of transformational change partners at a site of a microcosm of the macrocosm. And I think that there's something about like that kind of setup, and then the way that, race equity work in the, 2 minutes it was funded. Also, we found out through analysis later, and it wasn't unanticipated that a lot of that went to white dominant organizations. So I would say those are some of the, just naming what we see and experience. I'm curious what you all think. Yeah.
I just want to just follow that and just say that there's still so much segregation happening, like that in multiracial spaces. You find Black folk with Latino folk who haven't done their decolonizing work. And then you have Asian folk and white folk. And then Native spaces are very Native. It's like almost everyone's Native, and maybe there'll be one or two Black folk from the experience and the tribal groups that I work with. And so when there's like, in multiracial spaces, maybe there'll be one Native person of a whole staff team. And there's so much misinformation across all ways, right? Like anti-Blackness is alive and well in all communities, including Black communities, right? Like Native erasure and Native, dropping down into the wallpaper because I'm afraid is like something that happens. And so when you have that lack of work to say, like, in what ways are we recreating Native invisibility, like what Aja just said? Like, are we just naming the peoples but not being concerned about what are their land back struggles? How are we as a liberatory organization actually supporting Indigenous people to get their land back? And or like, how are we questioning the ways that the overburden placed on Black women is part of racialized capitalism and anti-Blackness? And how do we shift from like scarcity, overload, a sense, crisis and urgency mode to how do we create spaciousness and rest for people who have been targeted in these ways, and so so all that, like I see it playing out, and sadly, the way that it looks like is Black women and Native women fighting each other, right? Like one, feeling that they've experienced anti-Blackness, and I'm sure it is happening, right? And Native folks feeling like, are we ever going to be acknowledged and respected? So I'm a Southern Native, and so I know that part of my job is to support my Northern relatives to rematriate and to get their land back, and Black folks to have Black liberation. And so how do we, as liberatory change makers, supporting communities, how are each of us walking that walk and not just talking the talk, right? So that's and we do that at LREP. We're fortunate that we're tiny, and we, for a while, we're resourced well, and so each of us were engaged in land back and rematriation efforts wherever we were residing. And so that experience of actually doing that work it's just made things real for us.
Yeah, I think, I'm sorry, are you complete, Ámate? Okay. Um, yeah, I think the biggest way, if I could, you know, zoom up a little bit, is that organizations get in the way and reinforce. I think it's even beyond organizations, but the whole sector, if you will, like the nonprofit industrial complex, as we call it sometimes, um, gets in the way, is because what is actually required is scaling deep. And scaling deep is the antithesis of how nonprofits and the whole sector are set up. Everything from how resources work, timelines, siloing of issues, evaluation, like all those things.
Work schedules.
Yeah, even work schedules, all of that stuff. Parenthood, like being a good community member, they're all in tension with those expectations and setups. There's also a way in which, this isn't from the time I started, not maybe when I started, but probably 20 years ago. I got very clear that any kind of development, like work in this, whether it's organizational development, human development, leadership development, what have you, is all about remembering what it is to be human and what it is to be humane. And our organizations are not set up for that. So we're in that battle. Definitely what Aja talked about, the burden, and what Ámate talked about, the burden on women and Black women, Indigenous women of African descent and Turtle Island descent, carrying the burden. That's a big part of it. And even just the way racial equity and the whole system of DEI was formed. Was also set up in a way that actually isn't about liberation or sovereignty or rematriation or any of that, or repair or healing. As Aja alluded to, is about getting more people access to a racist settler colonialist project. And the nonprofit industrial complex is a function of racialized capitalism. It was a tax shelter set up for white people, at least for wealthy people. And wealthy people were predominantly white people. So there's all of that, right? And fighting those things, trying to unlearn and undo those things, also gets in the way of the scaling deep that we need to do. among us, which is why we're starting small and taking our own medicine first, as many cultures and folks do, and spreading out from there. But it takes a lot. Every time we're in these spaces, I have to consciously do work to forget that actually the first 2 times I was ever called the N-word were in Native spaces, right? It wasn't white people. Um, and yeah, and I know that there have been things in my family, right, that have completely been anti-Indigenous, right? And the last thing I'll just say about that is I also am, I don't know if the right word is play, but dancing with, living with, singing with, crying with, laughing with the choice that both my grandmothers, who were Turtle Island Indigenous, chose to marry dark-skinned Black men. And most of the folks I know who are both, it was the Turtle Island Indigenous women choosing, if they had to choose where they were going to assimilate, they chose Black folks, right? So there's something there also, right, that is completely antithetical to our nonprofit ways of understanding the world and trying to impact it.
Mm. I'm going to jump in. Elissa, thank you so much. I was like right there in that story and the both andness of that, right? Them choosing into Black community and then you being called that painful word with the Native community. And in preparation for this conversation, I did a lot of thinking about like similarities and differences between the two communities, right? And we've already named being detribalized as a strategy to crush our spirits, right? And the ways that Native Turtle Island people and Native African people, the journey that we have to reconnect to our spirit and our ways as a way of healing and finding liberation. But one thing that kept coming to me was land and the ways that like both people who were stolen from Africa and trafficked and Turtle Island folk were grieving for land, for stolen Africans because they don't know exactly which place they come from. And for me, like as a Turtle Island native, to be on a land where the white people own 90% of it and are destroying it. And I can't live like where my grandmother lived on the beach because now it's owned by all white people from the US. And so I'm grieving the fact that I can't have the intimate relationship that I need to have with land. And yet I know my land, I know my trees, I know what it smells like after it rains. And I know that it's painful, like for stolen Africans to not know that. And so like we're both grieving land, our severed connection to land, but in a different way, And so how do we make space for that different grieving and hold each other in that grieving and know that in the end, what it is that we're looking for is that deep connection to place and to land and to all the things that land and all the beings need to teach us. So I wanted to share that because that came so clearly to me.
Thank you all. I'm going to jump off.
Thanks so much,
2 minutes.
Aja. Thank you.
Yeah. Oh,
cool. Thank you.
Ámate. Oh, sorry. I
Go
know
ahead,
you.
go ahead.
I know you also have a hard stop, and I just want to quickly name that one of the practices that Ámate and Aja and I have been in with a slightly larger circle of folks is gathering in what we're calling the baskets of commonality that we see as portals to scaling deep. That exist across our cultures. And we've referred to several of them. But if we come together in ceremony, then the next strategies, next steps on the path, the guides, they show up, right? So we've been in storytelling ceremony. We've been in land practices together. We've been in food and medicine making practices together. Like that's what it has looked like to scale deep, which is not something that you go to an office building, and strategize around from your desk.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. And Ámate, if you have to hop, I totally understand. Deep gratitude for each of you and to Aja in absentia for everything you shared. I feel like I keep coming back to the land, as you said, Ámate, but also to rematriation and matriation. So as a Black American, I've always noticed from my Indigenous sisters generally, their naming of the matrilineal nature of their culture. And me, as a Black American, not exactly understanding what that means, even though in my culture as a child, I thought it was matriarchal, but then I developed an understanding of the broader system. So there is a similarity. We're all in the same patriarchy and colonizer basket, but there is something different in the cultural practices that have remained held in Indigenous culture over time from which we all need to learn. I haven't, but each of you has used the word rematriation a lot. I'm sure that most of our listeners don't actually know what that means. So if, as we close, you could share perhaps what rematriation looks like. And I think it's some of what you just spoke to, Elissa, in terms of the practices and the ceremony you've been in together. Because the answers lie in the land. I've heard people say, I'll sometimes say, I think it lies in rematriation. Because Black women and Indigenous women hold so much of this work because without us, our community, we would all be dead. So our role has been, and I think is critical, and it also kills us. So taking a break is important, which is why I can't join you next week, Elissa. And I'm really, really sad about that. So I hope that I can be invited into one of these baskets again sometime soon. So with that, what are your closing words to folks who may be listening and wondering where to go from here and how to be in solidarity?
I would love to answer the rematriation question because I literally just came back from a retreat with some of my rematriation siblings. And we have Karina Gold at the very end here, who is Surrogate. She's the tribal chairperson for the Ohlone in Berkeley. And so rematriation is about land back, right? Because in the end, it's like Native people need to be stewarding, caring for their lands. And so it's about getting as much land back to Native hands as possible. And then it's about caring for land in traditional ways and being able to repair the spirits of humanity through seeing what it looks like when you are in co-partnership with land and water and all the beings that live there. So, and it's rematriate because a lot of these efforts are being led by Native women and understanding. And for us, womanhood is not about biology, right? And so it's about the femme people who are up front, getting land back and actually repracticing cultural and spiritual ways on land with all people.
Yeah, I learned from Maya, and I can't remember Maya's last name right now, but from an organization called Mycelium Youth Network, and she talked about rematriation as both returning and evolving to. So it's not like going to a past, but it is bringing forward wisdom and sacred practices of the past and evolving into the future. A worldview of the land mothering us as opposed to us dominating the land. And, those weren't her exact words. So that's the understanding I took away from what she was saying about rematriation. And it really resonated with me that's the relationship.
Yeah. You're talking about Milagro.
No, it wasn't.
Oh, no.
It wasn't
Okay.
Lil. It was someone that works with Lil.
Thank you both. I want to be respectful of your time because I know you're both so busy. So deep gratitude for continuing to teach me and model so much of what I need to understand more deeply. So I hope we'll continue to be in space and practice and ceremony together. So sending each of you my love as you go on your way. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yakoki.
You are among my favorite people. So these are the spaces that keep us all going, especially in 2025.
Well, thank you for all the things you teach us and me.
Thank
Appreciate
you. Likewise. I hope you have an easeful weekend as much as possible.